The argument started over something trivial, whether to serve dinner at 6 or 6:30. But within minutes, my daughter-in-law Melissa had escalated it into a full-scale attack on my presence in their home. "You always have to control everything, don't you, Eleanor?" she snapped, slamming dishes around the kitchen with unnecessary force. "This is my house, my kitchen, my family dinner." I'd been living with my son Brian and Melissa for 6 weeks, recovering from hip replacement surgery. At 74, the recovery was taking longer than expected, and my doctor had insisted I needed family support rather than trying to manage alone in my 2-story house. "I was just making a suggestion," I said quietly. "Brian mentioned he gets hungry around 6 when he comes home from work." "Well, Brian can eat when I decide to serve dinner. He's my husband now, not your little boy who needs his mommy making decisions for him." The possessiveness in her voice was nothing new. Since marrying Brian 3 years ago, Melissa had been systematically trying to distance him from our family. Holidays were suddenly too stressful for her to attend. Sunday dinners became inconvenient due to her work schedule. Family traditions that Brian had cherished for 35 years were dismissed as outdated obligations. But Brian seemed oblivious to the manipulation, or perhaps he'd chosen willful blindness over confronting his wife's increasingly controlling behavior. "Melissa, you're right, it's your house and your dinner," I said, trying to diffuse the tension. "I appreciate you both letting me stay here during my recovery. Do we have a choice? You can't manage on your own anymore, and Brian feels guilty about putting you in assisted living." The words stung because they were partially true. My hip surgery had been more complicated than expected, and I was still using a walker 6 weeks later. But I wasn't helpless or financially dependent. I was temporarily physically limited while healing from a necessary medical procedure. What Melissa didn't know was that my apparent vulnerability masked considerable financial independence. The small pension and social security checks she'd seen were just a fraction of my income. My late husband Robert had been a successful patent attorney, and his intellectual property investments continued generating substantial royalties 20 years after his death. I lived modestly by choice, not necessity. The simple clothes, the older car, the frugal shopping habits, these were preferences developed during years when Robert and I were building wealth, not spending it. But Melissa saw only the surface and assumed I was a financial burden Brian was obligated to carry. "Brian doesn't feel guilty," I said. "He's being kind to his mother during a temporary recovery period." "Temporary? You've been here 6 weeks already, and you're still using that walker. How much longer is this temporary arrangement supposed to last?" Before I could answer, Brian walked in from work, immediately sensing the tension. "What's going on in here?" "Your mother is trying to control our dinner schedule again," Melissa said, not even looking at him. Brian glanced between us, clearly uncomfortable. "Mom, what did you say?" "I mentioned that you usually get hungry around 6. That's all." "See? She can't help herself," Melissa continued. "She has to insert herself into every decision we make." "Melissa, that's not..." "It's fine, Brian," I interrupted. "I'll eat in my room tonight." "No, Mom. You don't have to eat alone." Melissa whirled around to face him. "Of course you take her side. You always take her side." "I'm not taking sides. I'm just saying we can all eat dinner together like adults." "Adults? Your mother treats me like a child in my own home." As they argued, I quietly left the kitchen and went to my temporary bedroom, Brian's old office, which they'd converted for my stay. The room was small but comfortable, and I tried to minimize my impact by keeping my belongings organized and taking up as little space as possible. But apparently, my very presence was too much for Melissa to tolerate. An hour later, Brian knocked on my door. "Mom, I'm sorry about dinner. Melissa is just stressed about work." "It's fine, sweetheart. I understand this living arrangement isn't easy for anyone. She's not usually like this. She's been under a lot of pressure lately." I nodded, though I wondered what pressure could justify the systematic cruelty Melissa had been showing toward me for weeks. Small comments about my imposing on their hospitality. Suggestions that I was taking advantage of Brian's kindness. Implications that my recovery was taking too long and becoming burdensome. "Brian, how much longer do you think I'll need to stay here?" "The doctor said another few weeks until you can safely navigate stays. Maybe a month at most." And Melissa is okay with that timeline? Brian hesitated. She'll be fine. She just needs to adjust to having someone else in the house. But I could see the strain in his face. My presence was causing marital conflict, and Brian was caught between loyalty to his wife and obligation to his mother. That night, I called my longtime insurance agent, Patricia Wong, to update my coverage information. Eleanor, how are you recovering from the surgery? Slowly but surely. Patricia, I need to ask you about my jewelry coverage while I'm staying at my son's house. What kind of questions? My valuable pieces are currently here with me rather than in my home safe. Does that affect coverage if something happens to them? As long as they are in your possession, they are covered under your personal property policy. Are you concerned about security? Just being cautious. The pieces are quite valuable, and I want to make sure they are properly protected. Do you have current appraisals? Some of those pieces have probably appreciated significantly since we last updated the coverage. I have appraisals from 2 years ago. The wedding ring set alone was valued at $85,000. $85,000? Eleanor, that's quite a bit more than our current coverage shows. Robert invested in exceptional pieces over the years. The ring set includes a 4-carat center diamond with sapphire accents, all in platinum. It's been in his family for 3 generations. You should definitely update your coverage to reflect current values. Can you email me the appraisal documents? I'll send them tomorrow. As we spoke, I could hear Melissa and Brian arguing in their bedroom. The walls were thin, and Melissa's voice carried clearly as she complained about my continued presence, my demands on Brian's attention, and her feeling like a guest in her own home. The next morning, Melissa was particularly cold during breakfast. She served Brian coffee and toast, but didn't offer me anything, forcing me to awkwardly ask if I could make myself something to eat. Of course, she said with exaggerated sweetness. Help yourself to whatever you can find. As I moved slowly around the kitchen with my walker, Melissa watched with obvious impatience. You know, Eleanor, there are really nice assisted living facilities that specialize in post-surgical recovery. You might be more comfortable somewhere with professional staff to help you. I'm managing fine here, thank you. Are you? Because it seems like simple tasks are becoming quite difficult for you. Brian looked up from his newspaper. Mom's doing great. The physical therapist said she's ahead of schedule. Ahead of schedule? She's been here 6 weeks and still needs a walker to get around. Hip replacement recovery takes time, Melissa. How much time? Because I'm starting to feel like we're running a nursing home instead of living our own lives. The comment was cruel and intended to hurt. I excused myself to my room and spent the morning on phone calls with my insurance company, financial advisor, and attorney. If I was going to be treated like a burden, I wanted to ensure my assets were properly protected and my recovery plan was clear. That afternoon, while Brian was at work, Melissa confronted me directly. Eleanor, we need to talk. About what? About how long this arrangement is going to continue. The doctor said another few weeks. The doctor doesn't have to live with the tension you're creating in my marriage. I'm not trying to create tension, Melissa. Your very presence creates tension. Brian feels guilty about everything, guilty about your situation, guilty about my feelings, guilty about not being able to make everyone happy. I'm sorry you feel that way. Sorry isn't enough anymore. I want you to start looking into alternative arrangements. Alternative arrangements. Assisted living, in-home care, whatever it takes to get my husband's attention back to where it belongs, on his wife and his marriage. I stared at this woman who had been my daughter-in-law for 3 years, who had never shown any warmth or kindness toward me, who saw my temporary medical need as a threat to her territorial control over Brian. I'll discuss it with Brian when he gets home. Good. Because I'm done pretending this is working for our family. That evening, the confrontation came to a head during dinner. Brian had brought home flowers for Melissa, trying to smooth over the ongoing tension. But instead of appreciating the gesture, Melissa used it as ammunition. These are beautiful, honey. It's nice to have romantic gestures when we can actually enjoy them privately. The implication was clear. My presence was interfering with their romantic life. Melissa, that's not fair, Brian said. Mom isn't preventing us from having romance in our relationship. Isn't she? When's the last time we had a quiet dinner alone? When's the last time we could walk around our own house without worrying about disturbing your mother? She's recovering from surgery. She's not throwing parties in there. She doesn't have to throw parties to be disruptive. Her entire existence here is disruptive. I set down my fork. Maybe I should look into other arrangements. No, Mom. You're staying until the doctor clears you to go home. Melissa's face flushed with anger. So my feelings don't matter? My comfort in my own home doesn't matter? Of course your feelings matter. But Mom needs family support right now. Family support? What about spousal support? What about putting your wife's needs first? The argument escalated quickly, with Melissa demanding that Brian choose between his mother and his marriage, and Brian trying desperately to find a compromise that would satisfy everyone. Finally, Melissa stood up and walked to where I was sitting. You know what your problem is, Eleanor? You think you still have claims on Brian that supersede mine. I don't think that at all. Yes, you do. You wear that wedding ring like it gives you special status in his life. I looked down at my ring, Robert's beautiful family heirloom that I'd worn for 52 years. This ring represents my marriage to Brian's father. His father is dead, Eleanor. Brian has a new family now. I understand that. Do you? Because you act like that ring gives you permanent rights to Brian's loyalty. Before I could respond, Melissa grabbed my hand and tried to pull the ring off my finger. Melissa, stop. If the marriage is over, the ring should be too. I tried to pull away, but she was stronger and I was off balance. In one swift motion, she yanked the ring from my finger and walked over to the kitchen sink. He's mine now, she said, and dropped my ring down the garbage disposal. The sound of the disposal grinding was immediately followed by an ominous silence. Brian stared at his wife in complete shock. Melissa, what did you just do? I solved the problem. You destroyed Mom's wedding ring. That was a family heirloom. It was a symbol of competition for your attention. I sat at the table, staring at my naked ring finger for the first time in over 50 years. The violation felt almost physical, not just the loss of the ring, but the deliberate cruelty of destroying something irreplaceable. Melissa, that ring was worth more than your car, Brian said, his voice shaking with anger. So? It's just jewelry. It was my grandmother's ring. It was over 100 years old. Well, now it's gone, and maybe your mother will finally understand that her time as the most important woman in your life is over too. I quietly excused myself and went to my room, where I called Patricia Wong again. Patricia, I need to file a claim on my wedding ring. It's been destroyed. Oh no. What happened? It was deliberately thrown down a garbage disposal. Deliberately? Eleanor, that sounds like vandalism or theft. Have you contacted the police? Not yet. I want to understand my options first. Well, with an $85,000 value, this is definitely a police matter. The insurance company will require a police report for any claim this substantial. I understand. Eleanor, can I ask who destroyed the ring? My daughter-in-law. Your daughter-in-law destroyed an $85,000 heirloom? That's not just vandalism, that's a serious felony. As I hung up the phone, I could hear Brian and Melissa arguing violently in the kitchen. She was defending her actions as necessary to establish boundaries, while he was demanding she explain how destroying irreplaceable family property was acceptable behavior. What neither of them knew was that my ring was just one piece of a substantial jewelry collection that was carefully documented, insured, and appraised. They also didn't know that insurance investigations into high-value claims often uncovered related criminal activity. Most importantly, they didn't know that destroying my ring would trigger an investigation that would expose far more than just one woman's jealousy and cruelty. But they were about to learn that some actions have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate damage they cause. The next morning, I called Patricia Wong and formally filed the insurance claim for my destroyed wedding ring. The process required detailed documentation, police reports, and investigation into the circumstances of the loss. Eleanor, I need to warn you that claims of this magnitude trigger extensive investigations, Patricia explained. The insurance company will want to verify the value, examine the scene, and interview all parties involved. I understand. They'll also run background checks on everyone with access to the jewelry to look for patterns of similar incidents. What kind of patterns? Theft, fraud, previous claims. High-value jewelry destruction often isn't an isolated incident, it's part of a larger pattern of criminal behavior. I see. The investigator will be contacting you within 24 hours to begin the process. That afternoon, Detective Sarah Martinez from the police department's property crimes unit arrived to take my statement. She was thorough, professional, and clearly experienced with high-value theft cases. Mrs. Hartwell, can you walk me through exactly what happened to your ring? I described the dinner argument, Melissa's escalating anger, and her deliberate destruction of the ring. While stating his mind now. Was this the first time your daughter-in-law had expressed hostility toward your jewelry or personal belongings? I thought carefully. She's made comments about my expensive tastes and suggested that I was showing off when I wore nice pieces to family events. What kind of pieces? Earrings, necklaces, bracelets. My late husband collected quality jewelry over our 50-year marriage. And these pieces are currently in the house with you? Yes. I brought several valuable items when I moved in temporarily. Detective Martinez made careful notes. Mrs. Hartwell, I need to ask you about the total value of jewelry currently in your son's house. Approximately $300,000 in appraised value. Her pen stopped moving. $300,000. My husband was quite successful, and he invested in exceptional pieces over the years. Has any other jewelry gone missing or been damaged during your stay? Not that I've noticed, but I don't check on the pieces daily. I think we should verify that all your jewelry is still accounted for. We went to my room, where I opened the jewelry case I'd brought from home. It contained my most valuable pieces, the ones too precious to leave unattended in an empty house during my recovery. As I inventoried each piece, Detective Martinez photographed and catalogued everything. Diamond earrings worth $25,000. A sapphire necklace worth $40,000. A tennis bracelet worth $30,000. Several other pieces worth between $10,000 and $20,000 each. Everything appears to be here, I said, checking each compartment. Mrs. Hartwell, this is an extraordinary collection. Are you certain you want to keep pieces this valuable in a house where someone has already demonstrated willingness to destroy your property? What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that someone who would destroy an $85,000 ring in a fit of anger might be capable of stealing other valuable pieces. Melissa isn't a thief. She was angry and acted impulsively. Destroying $85,000 worth of property isn't an impulse, it's a serious felony. And in my experience, people who commit one type of property crime often commit others. Detective Martinez contacted the insurance investigator, Marcus Webb, who arrived that evening to examine the scene and interview all parties. Marcus was methodical and experienced, immediately focusing on the garbage disposal and kitchen area where the ring had been destroyed. Mrs. Hartwell, can you show me exactly where you were sitting when the incident occurred? I walked him through the entire sequence, from the argument to Melissa grabbing my hand to the sound of the disposal grinding my ring. And your son witnessed this? Yes. He was sitting right there. What was his reaction? Shock, followed by anger. He couldn't believe she'd destroyed a family heirloom. Marcus interviewed Brian next, confirming my account and adding details about the escalating tension that had led to the confrontation. Mr. Thompson, had your wife ever threatened your mother's property before? Not directly. But she'd made comments about Mom's jewelry being inappropriate for someone her age. What kind of comments? She said Mom was trying to show off her wealth and make Melissa feel inferior. Was your mother showing off her wealth? No. Mom lives very modestly. She only wears nice jewelry for special occasions. Has your wife ever expressed interest in your mother's jewelry collection? Brian paused. She's asked questions about it. About what pieces are worth, whether they are insured, that kind of thing. When did these conversations occur? Over the past few weeks, since Mom's been staying with us. Marcus made careful notes before calling Melissa in for her interview. Melissa was defensive from the moment she sat down, clearly understanding that she was in serious legal trouble. Miss Thompson, can you explain why you destroyed your mother-in-law's wedding ring? I was angry. It was a moment of impulse. An impulse that cost $85,000. I didn't know it was worth that much. You didn't know that a 4-carat diamond ring was valuable. Melissa shifted uncomfortably. I thought it was costume jewelry. Eleanor dresses so plainly, I assumed her jewelry was fake. But you've been asking questions about her jewelry collection for weeks. What? Who told you that? Your husband mentioned that you'd been asking about values and insurance coverage. I was just making conversation. Marcus pulled out a tablet and showed Melissa photos of my jewelry collection. Are you familiar with any of these pieces? Melissa looked through the photos, her face growing paler with each image. Have you ever handled any of these items? Maybe I've seen Eleanor wearing some of them. Have you ever removed any of these pieces from Mrs. Hartwell's jewelry case? Why would I do that? I don't know, Miss Thompson. That's why I'm asking. The interview continued for another hour, with Marcus asking increasingly specific questions about Melissa's knowledge of the jewelry, her access to my room, and her financial situation. After Melissa left, Marcus called me back into the kitchen. Mrs. Hartwell, I need to ask you to do something that might seem unusual. What's that? I want you to have all your jewelry professionally reappraised immediately. Why? Because in cases like this, the destroyed item is often just the tip of the iceberg. If someone has been planning to steal valuable jewelry, they often start by having pieces copied or replaced with fakes. You think Melissa might have stolen my jewelry? I think someone with access to $300,000 worth of portable valuables might be tempted to take some of it, especially if they believe the owner wouldn't notice immediately. But everything is still in my jewelry case. Everything that looks like your jewelry is still there. Whether it's actually your jewelry is a different question. The next morning, I took my entire collection to Bernard & Associates, the jewelry appraisers who had done my insurance evaluations for the past decade. Sarah Bernard examined each piece under magnification, comparing them to her detailed records and photographs from previous appraisals. Eleanor, I have some very concerning news. What kind of news? 3 of your pieces are not authentic. They are very good replicas, but they are not the original items I appraised 2 years ago. My heart sank. Which pieces? The sapphire necklace, the tennis bracelet, and the diamond earrings. Total value of the missing originals, $95,000. When could they have been replaced? The replicas are quite sophisticated. This would have taken weeks or months of planning, access to the originals for measurement and copying, and significant expense to create convincing fakes. Could someone have done this during my stay at my son's house? Possibly, if they'd been planning it for some time. Eleanor, this isn't random theft, this is organized, premeditated fraud. I called Detective Martinez immediately. Detective, the jewelry appraisal revealed that $95,000 worth of my pieces have been replaced with fakes. Which pieces? 3 major items that would have been easy to access and copy if someone had regular access to my jewelry case. Mrs. Hartwell, we need to expand this investigation immediately. This isn't just about your destroyed ring anymore. This is about a systematic theft operation. What happens now? Now we get a search warrant for your son's house and see what evidence we can find of the theft operation. You think Melissa is running a theft operation? I think someone is, and your daughter-in-law is the person with the most access to your valuable jewelry. That afternoon, Detective Martinez returned with a search warrant and a team of investigators. They searched every room in the house, looking for evidence of jewelry theft, replica creation, or fraud. In Melissa's closet, hidden behind winter coats, they found a small safe containing jewelry that wasn't hers, pieces that belonged to other elderly women, along with documentation that suggested a pattern of theft targeting vulnerable family members and house guests. Mrs. Hartwell, Detective Martinez said, showing me photographs of the recovered jewelry, do you recognize any of these pieces? I looked through the photos and immediately identified my missing items, the real versions of the pieces that had been replaced with fakes in my jewelry case. Those are definitely mine. But who do the other pieces belong to? We're running the jewelry through our database of reported thefts. But it appears your daughter-in-law has been systematically stealing valuable jewelry from elderly women and replacing it with fakes. How many victims? Based on what we've found so far, at least 6 other women. Total value of stolen jewelry appears to be over $500,000. Brian was devastated when the scope of Melissa's crimes became clear. I had no idea, he kept repeating. I thought she was just angry about Mom staying with us. Mr. Thompson, Detective Martinez explained, your wife appears to have been operating a sophisticated jewelry theft ring for at least 2 years. She targets elderly women with valuable collections, gains access to their jewelry, and replaces original pieces with high-quality fakes. But how did she know which pieces to target? She researches her victims carefully. Insurance records, appraisal documents, family conversations about valuable items. She plans these thefts for months before executing them. And the other victims? Elderly relatives, family friends, women in assisted living facilities. People who trust her and give her access to their personal belongings. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that my destroyed wedding ring had been the key that unlocked a much larger criminal operation. Melissa had been stealing from vulnerable elderly women for years, using her charm and apparent trustworthiness to gain access to their most precious possessions. The insurance claim for my ring had triggered the investigation that exposed her entire operation and would likely send her to prison for decades. Brian filed for divorce immediately, unable to process that he'd been married to someone capable of such systematic cruelty toward elderly victims. And I learned that sometimes the most devastating attack on your property reveals truths that protect other potential victims from experiencing the same violation. 6 weeks after Melissa's arrest, I sat in the district attorney's office reviewing the charges that would determine her fate. The scope of her criminal operation had grown with each day of investigation. Mrs. Hartwell, Assistant District Attorney Robert Chen explained, Melissa Thompson is facing 4 to 7 felony counts across multiple jurisdictions. The total value of her jewelry theft operation exceeds $750,000. 4 to 7 counts. Identity theft, fraud, grand larceny, elder abuse, and organized criminal activity. She's been targeting elderly women for over 3 years. How many victims in total? 12 confirmed, possibly more. The youngest victim was 68, the oldest was 92. How did she choose her targets? Family connections, volunteer work at senior centers, employment at assisted living facilities. She built relationships with vulnerable women, gained their trust, and then systematically robbed them. Detective Martinez opened a thick file. Mrs. Hartwell, your case was the key that broke this open. Without your insurance claim, these other victims would never have gotten justice. How did the other thefts work? Similar pattern to what she did to you. She'd identify valuable pieces, gain access to them, have replicas made, and swap them out. Most victims never realized they'd been robbed because the fakes were so sophisticated. Why did she destroy my ring instead of replacing it? Because you were living in her house where she couldn't control when you might notice the switch. Destroying it eliminated the evidence and looked like a crime of passion rather than premeditated theft. But the insurance investigation revealed the other stolen pieces. Exactly. Her impulsive destruction of your ring led to the appraisal that exposed the systematic thefts. Robert Chen showed me victim impact statements from the other elderly women Melissa had robbed. Each story was heartbreaking: family heirlooms stolen from women who had trusted her, financial losses that devastated fixed incomes, emotional trauma from being violated by someone they'd considered family. Mrs. Chen, age 86, lost her mother's engagement ring worth $45,000, he read. Mrs. Rodriguez, age 74, lost her grandmother's pearl necklace collection worth $30,000. Mrs. Williams, age 92, lost jewelry worth $85,000 that she'd planned to leave to her granddaughters. What will happen to Melissa? She's agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for 25 years in prison with possibility of parole in 15 years. She'll also be required to make full restitution to all victims. Can she actually pay restitution? She'll be paying for the rest of her life. The court will garnish her wages indefinitely until every victim is made whole. Detective Martinez pulled out another file. Mrs. Hartwell, there's something else you should know about how Melissa operated. What's that? She kept detailed records of her targets, including psychological profiles and vulnerability assessments. She showed me a notebook filled with Melissa's handwriting, containing profiles of each victim including personal details, family relationships, and security vulnerabilities. Under my name, Melissa had written, "Isolated during recovery, son feels guilty, extensive valuable collection, lives modestly so may not notice missing pieces immediately." She planned to rob me from the moment I moved in. She'd been planning it for months. Your hip surgery just provided the perfect opportunity. What about Brian? Did he know? There's no evidence your son was involved. Melissa appears to have operated entirely alone, using her marriage as cover for legitimate access to targets. Brian had been devastated by the revelations about his wife's criminal activities. The divorce had been finalized quickly, with Melissa waiving all rights to marital property in exchange for his cooperation with the investigation. "How is your son handling all this?" Robert Chen asked. "He's in therapy, trying to process how he could have been married to someone capable of such systematic cruelty toward elderly women. It's not uncommon for family members to be completely unaware of this type of criminal activity. Melissa was very skilled at compartmentalizing her crimes." 3 months after Melissa's sentencing, I received a letter from one of her victims, Mrs. Chen, the 86-year-old woman whose engagement ring had been stolen. "Dear Mrs. Hartwell," it began, "I wanted to thank you for being brave enough to file the insurance claim that exposed Melissa Thompson's crimes. Without your courage, I would never have known that my mother's ring had been stolen, and I would never have gotten justice. Like you, I trusted Melissa completely. She volunteered at my assisted living facility, helping residents with personal tasks and errands. She was so kind and helpful that when she offered to clean my jewelry for me, I was grateful for her assistance. I never suspected that she was cataloging my valuables and planning to rob me. When she returned my jewelry cleaned, I had no idea that my most precious pieces had been replaced with fakes. It wasn't until the police contacted me about your case that I learned I had been victimized. The replica of my engagement ring was so convincing that I had worn it for 8 months without realizing it wasn't the ring my mother had given me 60 years ago. But thanks to your willingness to pursue justice, I now have my real ring back, and Melissa Thompson will spend decades in prison where she can't hurt any more elderly women. You saved not just the victims she had already robbed, but all the future victims she would have targeted if her operation had continued. With deep gratitude and respect, Margaret Chen." I read similar letters from other victims, all expressing gratitude that my destroyed wedding ring had led to the investigation that recovered their stolen heirlooms and exposed Melissa's systematic targeting of vulnerable elderly women. Brian and I had grown closer through the ordeal, bonded by our shared experience of being betrayed by someone we'd trusted. He'd moved back into my house to help with my continued recovery, and we'd started having honest conversations about family relationships, trust, and recognizing red flags in people's behavior. "Mom, I keep thinking about all the warning signs I ignored," he said during one of our evening talks. "What kind of warning signs?" Melissa's obsession with other people's possessions. Her detailed questions about family finances and valuables. The way she'd befriend elderly people and then drop them suddenly. You couldn't have known she was a criminal. But I could have paid attention to how she treated vulnerable people. I could have noticed that her kindness toward elderly people was actually predatory. What will you do with that knowledge going forward? I'll pay attention to how people treat those who can't protect themselves. I'll trust my instincts when someone's behavior doesn't feel right. And I'll never again choose comfort over confronting obvious problems. 1 year after the wedding ring incident, I hosted a small gathering for the other victims of Melissa's theft ring. We'd all recovered our stolen jewelry, and several lasting friendships had formed from our shared experience. "Eleanor," Margaret Chen said as we looked at our recovered pieces, "it's strange to think that something so horrible led to something so positive." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Melissa's cruelty toward you exposed her cruelty toward all of us. Your destroyed ring saved our stolen heirlooms. And it probably saved future victims who will never know how close they came to being robbed," added Mrs. Rodriguez. "Plus, we've all learned to be more careful about who we trust with access to our valuables," Mrs. Williams noted. "That's a lesson worth having, even if it came at a terrible cost." As I looked around the room at these strong, resilient women who had survived a systematic predator's attacks, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had started with my hip surgery and led to exposing a major criminal operation. Melissa had destroyed my wedding ring in a moment of jealous rage, thinking she was eliminating a symbol of my connection to Brian. What she'd actually done was trigger an investigation that would put her in prison for decades and recover hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen heirlooms for elderly victims. My ring was gone forever. No amount of insurance money could replace 52 years of memories attached to Robert's family heirloom. But its destruction had protected other elderly women from losing their own irreplaceable treasures to a predator who saw our vulnerability as opportunity. Sometimes the most devastating personal loss leads to the most important community protection. Sometimes the cruelest individual act exposes the pattern of systematic abuse that allows justice to finally be served. And sometimes the ring that gets destroyed saves all the rings that would have been stolen if the destruction had never happened. Brian still felt guilty about not protecting me from Melissa's attack. But I reminded him that his wife's moment of rage had accidentally protected dozens of other elderly women from her calculated crimes. The wedding ring was gone, but the love it represented, the love that had created the family relationships Melissa tried to destroy, remained stronger than ever. In the end, Melissa had been right about one thing: the ring had represented competing claims on Brian's loyalty. But what she hadn't understood was that destroying it wouldn't eliminate the competition. It would reveal who was truly worthy of that loyalty. A mother who had spent 50 years building a loving family relationship, or a wife who spent 3 years systematically robbing elderly women while pretending to care for them. Brian's choice, when faced with that contrast, had been immediate and permanent. 2 years after Melissa's sentencing, Brian remarried, this time to a woman who worked as a victim's advocate and had helped several of Melissa's victims through their recovery process. Sarah understood the importance of protecting vulnerable people rather than exploiting them. At their wedding, I wore a new ring, not a replacement for the destroyed heirloom, but a new piece that represented new beginnings and the family's commitment to choosing partners who brought out their best qualities rather than enabling their worst impulses. "Mom," Brian said as we danced at his reception, "I know I can never replace Dad's ring or undo what Melissa did to it." "You don't need to replace it, sweetheart. You've replaced something much more important." "What's that?" "You've replaced a wife who saw elderly people as targets with a wife who sees them as people deserving protection. That's worth more than any ring." As I looked around the reception at the guests, including several of Melissa's former victims who had become close family friends, I thought about how destruction and creation were sometimes inseparably linked. Melissa's destruction of my ring had created the investigation that saved other rings, created the justice that other victims deserved, and created the awareness that protected future targets from her crimes. Most importantly, it had created the clarity Brian needed to see the difference between love that protects and love that exploits, between marriage that strengthens family bonds and marriage that systematically destroys them. The ring was gone forever. But the love it had symbolized, the love that builds families, protects the vulnerable, and chooses justice over comfort, that love had multiplied and spread to people who had never even known Robert but who benefited from the investigation his ring had triggered. Sometimes the most precious thing you lose leads to the most important thing you find. And sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to let someone's cruelty go unexamined, even when that examination reveals truths too painful to ignore. The garbage disposal had destroyed an heirloom. But it had also destroyed a criminal operation that was systematically targeting the very people families should protect most carefully. In the end, that seemed like a fair trade: one ring's destruction in exchange for a dozen elderly women's protection, one family's temporary pain in exchange for multiple families' permanent peace of mind. Melissa had thrown my ring down the disposal, saying, "He's mine now." But love, real love, can't be claimed through destruction of what came before. Real love has to be owned through protection of what matters most. And what mattered most, it turned out, wasn't the ring itself. It was the principle that elderly people deserve safety, respect, and protection from those who would exploit their trust. That principle had survived the garbage disposal intact. And it would outlast any prison sentence, any divorce, and any amount of restitution Melissa would ever be able to pay.